Thanks for having me here. I think we might get flying cars, but we're still on 140 characters. I don't know if you know the controversy there, but when I was speaking to Ethan, one of the topics of discussion was what has Singapore done, and how that could, what are the lessons that some of the other cities could learn. But before that, I thought maybe take a step back and try and understand where smart cities are today and what the path is going forward, because we've heard a lot about ideas coming out of different parts of the world, but not really seen sort of full-fledged implementation if you're really being honest to ourselves. Before that, I think was a good introduction. There are some of the products that I worked on: Google Wallet, Android Pay, Wi-Fi router that Google launched, and also had the opportunity to work on the 100-station Wi-Fi network in India. So been through a bunch of products. Hopefully some of that thinking comes through. Right now, I'm partnered at SeedPlus. We are a seed stage venture capital fund out of Singapore, and we invest in sort of early stage companies that have product differentiation. And one of the areas I personally look at is IoT. And smart cities, obviously, being in Singapore, cannot be ignored, and we see a lot of ideas. But going back, I had a simple thing that any ex-Googler would do, which is do this: search for smart cities. And the images that pop up were quite telling. Everything here talks about infrastructure, talks about sensors, it talks about networks. I think there's some fascinating maps here, but where are the people? I think what we've done when we've kind of thought about smart cities is that we have looked at a very different worldview. What we have today is a central authority that typically looks at procuring some amount of infrastructure, puts out an RFP typically, and has a vendor that basically gets some money from the city council. And this centralized model has been sort of dominating the landscape for a while now. It's the procurement implementation of infrastructure by sort of a central authority, and with good reason. I think there've been fascinating sort of developments in the last 100 years that have led to the development of this model. And if you go back in time and even sort of think about how infrastructure has been built, it's always been sort of it's always been a revolution. I mean, even if you go back in time to the early stages of the automobiles, there are a lot of cities that had to catch up from being built for horse-driven carriages to automobiles. And there were some cities that just did not exist at that time and went straight to 8-lane sort of highways right in the middle of the city. But I think the model is changing, and what we've seen now is more of citizens sort of taking decisions for themselves by sharing or allocating assets that were previously sort of not possible to allocate amongst users. And I say users because it's a sort of a two-sided marketplace that we're talking about here. You have people who have assets that can be monetized, and you have users that want to solve certain problems using those assets. So you have a bunch of ideas here around transportation, real estate, information, pure play information technology, and then you have networks. I think one missing here that I probably did not add was some neighborhood social networks that have a lot of data, like Nextdoor. But fundamentally, what's happened is mobile plus internet has driven the adoption of private platforms like it has never before. And this is a discontinuity that cannot be ignored, because it's changing the model of how consumers behave. They're not looking at a central authority to actually implement technology for them or even solutions, but they are driving the creation of some of these use cases. So it's a foundationally a different model than what the world has seen in the recent past. Maybe not. This number up here is probably the most famous smart city app that the world has seen, and we all know about it. It's 911. This is the number of calls that 911 gets every year. At least in 2016, this was the number reported. This is an example of a 50-year-old technology that's existed on distribution communication platforms for a very long time. Started in 1967 by AT&T in a couple of cities in America, and then now, probably in Canada as well. But the bottom line here is we've seen this story before. When the user is at the center of any infrastructure development and adopts it, the likelihood of success is much, much higher than sort of a model of procurement. And that is sort of the direction in which I urge sort of the ecosystem to think. The computing power in this picture alone is massive. If everyone here has a mobile device, you're talking about petabytes of data, and you're talking about insane amount of computing power. And this device alone, in my opinion, has been underutilized today. We talk about sensors that are not with the user, sensors in the environment. But honestly, if you think about mobile phone penetration alone and what you can do with this device and the amount of sort of sensors available and the dividends of the smartphone war, if I may call it that, there's a lot of power packed into that single device. The question is, can entrepreneurs unleash what has already started to use these sensors for sort of next generation solutions? That brings me sort of to my next point on, how can you combine mobile phones with unused infrastructure? There's a ton of unused infrastructure out there. Had sort of an experience looking at it when we were developing Google Station in India, where we had about 100 stations to wire up and billions of people walking in every day. And how do you sort of get 4G or later connectivity to so many people simultaneously without uncongested backhaul? Turns out there's sort of a massive network of fiber running through all the stations in India, 6 Gbps backhaul to every station. So that's how we got there. But the knowledge and the infrastructure exists. It's a question of using it. Seen the same story on power lines. All power lines, or many of them that were developed, have fiber optic. Uses only one channel. You can possibly use it for other purposes. The question is, can we spot unused infrastructure instead of sort of relying on new build? And I think that leads to sort of the ideas that have created billion-dollar companies. And therefore, to summarize, centralized authority to citizen-driven. What used to be privately owned is now for public usage. Ownership models translating to rental. And what used to be static is now kind of dynamic. You never thought you're going to pay dynamic pricing for cabs, but you do now, and you're okay with it. So things are going to change. And companies thought of physical assets as sort of very important to them. I think increasingly it's the users and the data that is generated that's becoming critical to companies. So fundamental shift in the mindset of companies is necessary. But you know what? I don't think it's all fun and games when you let private enterprise alone innovate. And that's where I think a balanced model becomes critical. This picture is from China, and this is the shared bike parking lot. I don't think it was meant for that, but it's become that. So if you let venture capital and private enterprise go unchecked, it can lead to some interesting outcomes that I don't think we want to see, but it happens. And therefore, the question for city councils becomes what's the right sort of balance? And I've not held a public position, so I'm not in any way going to talk about what it takes, or it's a hard problem and there are multiple solutions, but what I can do is sort of tell you what Singapore has done to some extent and see if some of that applies, because a lot of what Singapore does is unique and probably doesn't apply to other cities, given it's a city state. But some of the learnings from Singapore that we've seen has been that city runs like a business, and there's limited real estate as a country, and so optimization is sort of built in. Anything that is planned is thought through to the point where they want to use minimum real estate for it. There's also some brainstorming that happens around what will happen, just decades out. So super planned, top down, and every sort of nuance is thought through much before time. But interestingly, there's a light touch approach to bottom-up innovation. So while other cities were outright banning Uber, I don't think we saw Singapore actually doing that. They thought through sort of the consequences of what would happen if more cars come on the road, and if they have competition from, for example, Grab and Uber were going at it, and there were 3 or 4 other companies at one point. So I think there's been a light touch approach, a sensible light touch approach, but it's one that has been developed through constant discussions with the private sector. We've obviously got very tech-savvy regulators. I mean, if you've had the chance or opportunity to talk to some of the Singapore regulators, it's really surprising how technology-savvy they've been. They understand the consequences of adoption of a particular technology. Importantly, low lag times. So if they see something's broken, there's a recommendation that comes in pretty much quickly. So this really helps iterate through ideas that may spin out of control and might be off the guardrails. So these are some of the lessons that Singapore has, and there's obviously lots more that I can get into, but the other one, and the most important one possibly, is being efficient brokers between startups and infrastructure. And I think the procurement angle, I couldn't say it's sort of more about. They've actually created a separate procurement process for startups to participate in bids that might lead to the usage of that product in deployment. And there's a different channel for that. But you go through evaluation, you go through sort of product testing. But it's one of the things that's really helped startups sell into the government organizations if they want their solution to be deployed. Last but not the least, I think all cities know this, but they're sitting on a lot of data. And what's the best way to sort of harness this advantage to get applications to start developing on top? And that's been sort of the struggle that a lot of the cities have had. And Singapore's sort of taken one approach where they've done this with Dazzle Aviation. It's called Virtual Singapore, where it's a 3D model, I think, that emanated from the flight simulator mode. And what they've done is sort of enabled businesses and users to pay and use this platform to simulate various scenarios. There are private companies other than Dazzle that are providing it, mostly emanating from the gaming side of the world. But this is what Singapore's done. It's pretty useful. You might want to take a look at some of the simulations that people have run. They're available publicly, some of them. This talks about the wind flow. It also covers sunshine, shade, water, a few other things. Also, the volume and area of individual buildings. So something interesting that's come out of sort of bottoms up. We have this data. Now how do users and businesses use it? But what does that mean for us as a venture capital fund? This is all great. We've seen sort of a new era of startups that are reallocating assets using mobile devices and so creating marketplaces. But what does that mean for a fund like ours that focuses on IoT? What do we look at? We think that a lot of these bottom-up services will have second-order impact. And by second-order impact means that a lot of them would need, for example, will develop new insurance types, as a very simple example. Ride-sharing would need different insurance. Can I insure just one trip? If I see that the driver's not got a great rating, can I insure this trip? Can I buy sort of micro-insurance, as an example? Hardware becoming optional. This is an interesting one. We get a lot of hardware-centric ideas. We get a lot of ideas that come out of models where I have a piece of hardware and I'm trying to sort of create a business around it. But if you look at all the successful sort of startups that have designed IoT ideas, you start with solving a problem. Now, the best example of that would be sort of the biking startups out of China again, but really they're all connected bikes. And if you start by saying, I want to sell a connected bike, you're not going to get very far. But if you start with the service and the hardware is sort of optional, you have billions of users riding around connected bikes. So, really, we think hardware is optional. It's an extension of the service strategy. The last one is sort of the second last one, is that everything will go IP. We truly believe that there are a lot of protocols out there, some legacy, but all of them will eventually move to IP. That's just because connectivity is better on IP. It's faster, it's lighter, and all the other benefits. And we think that with all the data being generated on this, private platforms or cities, we think that privacy and security will be the data AI of tomorrow. We think that that's going to be the thrust of many of the governments and many of the challenges we face in the future. That's about it. Thank you.